Okay, we're going to cover topic 2, the chemistry of living things, for review. You should have your note packet open, and hopefully you've completed topic 1 and you did the Regents practice questions in Schoology. So let's talk about chemistry of living things. We know that all living things have to maintain homeostasis to stay alive. So homeostasis is when you maintain a stable internal environment. And if you have failure to maintain homeostasis, it can result in illness or death. Homeostasis is often maintained using feedback mechanisms. And a feedback mechanism is a cycle in which the product of one reaction causes another reaction to start or stop. It's kind of like a chain reaction. While organisms are balanced, they're not unchanging. The term used to describe the balanced state, we typically use dynamic equilibrium and homeostasis almost interchangeably. Dynamic equilibrium is relating to a balanced state created by many small opposing changes. For example, if you're driving or your parents are driving and you're trying to stay right at the speed limit, sometimes you have to push on the gas to accelerate to get up to the speed limit, and if you go over the speed limit, you have to either brake or let up on the accelerator. And that's how you're making these small changes to try and stay exactly at that speed limit. Well, your body has to do the same thing. It's constantly making minor adjustments to keep at this steady state. So here's an example of a feedback mechanism cycle. One example would be maintaining body temperature. So one way you could fill this in is if we have a high body temperature, your body starts to sweat, then you cool off. And then if you have too low of a body temperature, you would start to shiver and you would warm up. So that would be one way to fill in this chart. So actually I think I'll have you guys do that. At the top, you could write in you're too hot. Body is too hot. And then and the arrow going to the right, so we're looking at this arrow right here, you could write that your body starts to sweat. And then in this box here, you would write that your body returns to normal temperature. Down at the bottom, you can say your body is too cold. And on this arrow, the bottom left, you could say your body starts to shiver, your muscles shiver. And then on the left-hand square, you could say that your body has returned to a normal temperature. And it kind of goes through this cycle, small minor changes, to keep you at the right temperature. It works the same for blood sugar. Blood sugar is something that's important for everyone to maintain a constant level of. Otherwise, you don't feel very well if your blood sugar spikes too high or goes too low. And if you continually have problems with it, for example, if you have problems with insulin controlling your blood sugar, you could have the disease called diabetes. So let's say you've just eaten a meal and then your blood sugar is really high. So in the top square, you could say high blood sugar or high glucose, blood glucose levels. And what happens then is on the arrow on the right here, you would write that your body releases insulin. Your pancreas is going to produce insulin, and it's going to lower your blood glucose back to normal. So that's what you would put in the right-hand box. And then time will go by, and if you don't eat for a while, then your blood sugar might be too low. So you could put that in the bottom box. So then it would trigger your body to either make you eat, or the other thing that could happen is you would release a hormone from your pancreas called glycogen, which would go on this arrow, and that's going to pull glucose out of your liver where it's stored and bring it back up to normal. And that's what goes in this left-hand box, that blood glucose is back up to normal. Okay, so life processes in general, these are all the living things. Well, these are all the things that living things need to do to maintain homeostasis, and we call it metabolism. All of these processes together are considered metabolism. So metabolism are all the life processes needed to maintain homeostasis. Nutrition is the first one. This is using nutrients for growth, synthesis, repair, and energy. Then we have respiration. This would be the cellular respiration. It converts energy in food into a usable form called ATP. Synthesis, remember synthesis means to make, so organisms need to make complex chemicals from simple ones. Then we have transport. Your body has to have a way of absorbing and distributing materials. Regulation, this is the control and coordination of life processes. This is when we think about nervous system and endocrine system. Then we have excretion. That's when we remove the wastes produced by metabolic activities. And heredity, you're passing genes on to offspring. Okay, moving on to the actual chemistry of life, we have inorganic chemicals. These are simple compounds like water, H2O. It's the most common substance in all living things. About 60 to 70% of our body mass is water. It's needed for chemical reactions. These reactions do not happen in dry conditions, so we have to have water in our cells. And water also helps to dissolve other molecules into a solution, which can then be transported to other cells and throughout your body. Oxygen is another inorganic molecule. It's needed by most, not quite all, but most organisms for chemical respiration or cellular respiration. It is released by plants and algae as a waste product of photosynthesis. And then there's aerobic respiration. That means oxygen is needed. It's a process that uses oxygen to extract energy from glucose, and it's used by most organisms. So your cells or any aerobic respiration cells are going to take glucose and break it apart to produce ATP energy. The other process called anaerobic respiration is a process that extracts energy from glucose without using oxygen. It provides less energy, so it's only used by very simple organisms like bacteria and yeast. These organisms do not need to take in or breathe in oxygen. Usually these bacteria are going to live in very extreme conditions. Another inorganic molecule is carbon dioxide. And with water, it's used by plants to make glucose in the process of photosynthesis. It is a waste product of aerobic respiration. Then we have nitrogen. It's the most common gas in the air, believe it or not. About 70% of the air around you is made up of nitrogen, but our bodies are not adapted to use it. We're only really adapted to be able to use oxygen. So we do need it to make protein, though. So how do we get it into our bodies? Well, it can be converted, this gas in the air can be converted into ammonia by soil bacteria. And then those nitrates, those ammonia nitrates are absorbed by the plants, and then we eat them, and that's how we get nitrogen that we need. And then by organisms that have consumed plants, they excrete that nitrogen again as waste in sweat or urine, and it can be returned back to the environment. And then we have acids and bases. These are used for different functions in the body, like in your intestines and your stomach for digestion. It's measured on the pH scale. Very high and very low pHs are usually lethal, especially in our bodies. pH can affect the rates of chemical reactions. For example, digestive enzymes work the fastest in acidic environments, which is why we make stomach acid or hydrochloric acid. You know, in our stomachs, it's very acidic, like a 1 on the pH scale. And so the enzymes that are in your stomach they only function at a low pH. If it gets higher, then they stop functioning. Organic compounds. These are typically larger, more complex chemicals. They always contain the elements carbon and hydrogen, and I want you to underline and highlight that sentence, that they contain the elements carbon and hydrogen. It's going to help you out a lot. Organic compounds are synthesized from simpler substances or building blocks. So carbohydrates are the first category of organic compounds. Remember, there's 4 of them. These are going to be your sugars and starches. The building blocks, or the atoms that make it up, are carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. They function as an immediate source of energy or stored energy in the larger form like starch. And you're finding it in structure. Structural parts of organisms like cellulose in plants. Cellulose is like that stringy stuff in celery. Then we have lipids. This is our second group of organic compounds. Fats, oils, and waxes. They're made of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen as well. They function in stored energy mostly. Waterproofing. They make up your cell membranes. And they help insulate and cushion organs. We have proteins. These are very important. They're complex compounds that carry out all of the body's activities. They are made of carbon, hydrogen, and nitrogen and oxygen. After water, proteins are the most plentiful substance in the body. They have many different functions, and their function is determined by their shape. That's going to be an important fact as well. You may want to highlight that too. We think of like a lock and key model when you're thinking about proteins and how they work. You have a specific key that you have to use to get into your house. Not just any old key will unlock your front door. Only one specific shape does. And that's kind of how proteins work. They have to have the right shape to fit with other molecules. And if you change the shape of the protein, it's going to change what it can interact with, which ultimately changes its function. If you take your front door key and you file it down, it's not going to work anymore. It's not going to do its original function. So that's how proteins work. On this diagram at the bottom, we've got structures A and B on the left-hand side. I'm not sure why they're upside down, though. And then we have structure C, D, and B all the way at the right. I want you to label structure A. That's going to be called your reactant, or you can call it your substrate. So structure A, even though it's upside down, that's our reactant or our substrate. Structure B on all 3 images there, that's your enzyme. Your enzyme has that cutout area. That cutout area is called the active site, so you're going to label that part the active site. And your substrate should fit perfectly into the active site. In the middle here, this is what we call the enzyme substrate complex. And then after the reaction is completed, you have the products. C and D are your product. The enzyme we know is letter B because it remains unchanged throughout this reaction. It doesn't get used up, it doesn't get changed. So here's some important types of proteins. Hormones and neurotransmitters. They carry messages throughout the body. They have a specific shape, and on all of the cells of your body, they have things called receptors, which also have specific shapes. And if the hormone can fit into that receptor, then it can send a message to that particular cell. So these are definitely very important. And if there's anything wrong with the shapes of the hormones or neurotransmitters, that message can't be delivered. Cell receptors, like I just said, they're going to have a specific shape as well. So they can receive hormone and neurotransmitter messages. And you're going to find those in the cell membrane. They're embedded in there. Antibodies. Antibodies are a protein. It's not a type of cell. It is produced by your white blood cells, and it's got a specific shape to it. And it will attack foreign pathogens. And your antibodies are very specific in their shape. What's happening right now is that people who are either have been sick with coronavirus or are getting vaccinated for it are producing antibodies that if you're exposed again in the future, your body is going to be able to produce antibodies much more quickly that are perfectly shaped for the coronavirus to destroy it, so that you won't be sick from it if you're exposed to it in the future. So that's why it's important to have any vaccine, so that if you're ever exposed to any of those disease organisms, your body can produce antibodies very quickly to destroy those specific ones. One vaccine does not destroy any disease. They are very specific. And your body can produce those very specific antibodies if they're exposed to the right ingredients within that vaccine. Enzymes, these are super, super important. They're going to act as catalysts that control all the chemical reactions in the body. Sometimes they're referred to as biological catalysts, and I want you to write that down next to enzymes because it will throw you if you don't remember that that's another term they like to use. Then we have high temperatures. High temperatures are going to cause enzymes to denature or fall apart and lose their shape, and then they'll stop functioning. And that's why high fevers are dangerous. When you have a high fever like 104 or 105, it starts to denature the enzymes in your cells, and the chemical reactions in your cells are going to not work very well. And that's why you don't feel well, and if it stays that way for too long, then you could die. pH fluctuations can also cause enzymes to denature and stop functioning. So your body has to constantly maintain the right pH in your blood and in your cells so that it doesn't denature your enzymes. And then we have nucleic acids. This is our fourth category. So we talked about carbohydrates, lipids, and proteins. Now these nucleic acids are things like DNA and RNA. And don't forget ATP falls in here too. Their main functions, though, they make up genes and chromosomes, and they store and transmit hereditary information. The building blocks of nucleotides, you've got a 5-carbon sugar, a phosphate group, and a nitrogen base. So the building blocks would still be carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and phosphorus, but to put together a whole string of DNA, it's made up of nucleotides. And that nucleotide, one nucleotide, has a 5-carbon sugar, a phosphate group, and a base. And remember, the bases are adenine, guanine, cytosine, and thymine, or uracil, depending on if it's DNA or RNA. So here's our picture of DNA. And the reason why we know this is DNA, number one, is it's double-stranded. RNA is single-stranded. The other reason we know it's DNA is because they're using thymine. Thymine is only found in DNA. In RNA, it would say uracil. And then the third way we know that this is DNA is it's telling us we're looking at the sugar deoxyribose. If it was RNA, it would just be a ribose sugar. So you can see how the blue things are the phosphates, the hexagon or the pentagons here are the sugars, and they make up the sides, the backbone. And then in the middle is where you find the bases, and they match together adenine with thymine, cytosine with guanine. And the way I remember it is Akron Tigers, go Cats. Or there was that video, Apples in the Tree, Car in the Garage, from the Amoeba Sisters. They kind of use that to help remember. Okay, and that takes us to the end of the chemistry of life. So please go ahead and answer your questions for homework.